Well, we heard a short time ago from that group of lawyers who've now announced they will take the case of the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, killed by Israeli forces, to the International Criminal Court. The International Centre for Justice for Palestinians said Shireen's family gave permission for their legal action. They're representing Palestinian journalists who they say were systematically targeted by Israeli forces. Our correspondent Nadeem Barber was at the press conference. He asked how hopeful the lawyers are that the ICC can achieve justice for Shireen and other Palestinian journalists.
I mean, I have to be as confident as the pre-trial chamber ruling, and the pre-trial chamber ruling is very clear. The ICC's jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction, extends over the territories that we're speaking about. That means that the ICC prosecutor can issue a warrant for the arrest of perpetrators, if the action or the crime took place in that territory under its jurisdiction. And then that has severe consequences for the individual perpetrator, whether they're inside Israel or not. You may well be aware that many countries have reciprocal legislation. So, for example, the United Kingdom has legislation which means that it's also obliged to prosecute people under the Rome Statute in our jurisdiction, and also in some circumstances hand people over to the ICC where a prosecution is likely to happen. Now, I don't see any reason why, if the rules are applied and they're not interfered with, why perpetrators from Israel will not be prosecuted.
Well, let's join Nadeem Barber, who was at that press conference in London. And Nadeem, a very impassioned and methodical as well press conference by the speakers there. And certainly it gave everyone food for thought as to how Al Jazeera and various journalist organisations will proceed now towards the ICC.
That's right. I mean, the speakers themselves didn't need to be impassioned, because the strongest presentation here was the videos which showed various Palestinian journalists who'd been killed or maimed by members of the Israeli armed forces while doing their jobs, while clearly marked as press. We heard from Walid al-Umari, the bureau chief, the Jerusalem bureau chief of Al Jazeera, talking us through the horrific events of that day when he found out that his colleague Shireen had been killed covering events in Jenin. It's been pointed out that she was unusual in that she was such a celebrity in the Arab world, but there are dozens of other cases of journalists in the occupied Palestinian territories being deliberately targeted by Israeli forces over the years. So now this case that's being taken to the ICC is going to involve Shireen's killing, as well as the injury of her colleague Alia Samoudi in the same incident. But it had started in April of this year, going back, covering other cases. And I'm joined now by Jennifer Robinson, a lawyer who's involved in the case which is being taken. Jennifer, can you explain to me what originally the file contained and how Shireen's killing merges into that?
Thank you. So we filed a complaint in April this year in relation to 4 cases of the killing and maiming of Palestinian journalists by the Israeli forces in April. Those 4 named journalists were emblematic and chosen because of the nature of the targeting of journalists in the region. Since Shireen Abu Akleh's killing, obviously there's now international and global attention to this issue, and we're grateful to accept instructions from her family to now add her case and those of the journalists with her to this ICC complaint. It certainly adds weight and strength to the complaint, and we hope that the ICC prosecutor will now open an investigation into all of their deaths.
We've seen Al Jazeera also announce that it's got its own case that it wants to take, specifically accusing the Israeli authorities of targeting its journalists because of what they do. Is that a common theme that you would say applies to all of the other journalists? Is it your contention that Israel has tried to silence Palestinian journalists?
This is precisely why we are bringing the ICC complaint. For too long, Palestinian journalists have been targeted precisely because, as I explained earlier, it is a war crime to deliberately target journalists, and it is a war crime to cover up other war crimes. It is to stop and to silence objective reporting on the ground, the documentation of human rights abuse. That's why journalists are targeted, and that's why we say this case is so serious, and the ICC ought to be looking at the targeting of journalists in particular, as opposed to other civilian deaths. Now, we are alleging that it amounts not just to a war crime, but that the widespread and systematic targeting of Palestinian journalists, Al Jazeera staff, other media workers on the ground, is a crime against humanity and ought to be prosecuted by the ICC.
Now, we've just heard briefly from Tayyab, from the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians, about why it's possible for the ICC to go forward in the absence of Israeli cooperation. For you, does that create a problem or not?
It ought not create any problems. It may well create a practical problem. But the key issue is the ICC has itself found jurisdiction over the territories in which we are talking about, the occupied Palestinian territories. That is where these targetings took place. That is where these journalists were deliberately targeted and maimed. These cases are within the jurisdiction of the ICC. The ICC prosecutor has the power to investigate, and we say they ought to do so. And those who are responsible ought to be prosecuted and held criminally responsible for their acts.
Jennifer Robinson, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Well, Walid Al-Omari, who I was mentioning before, the Jerusalem bureau chief, pointed out that it's not just Al Jazeera making these accusations, but there have been a whole range of media organisations, including the Associated Press and CNN, which have done their own investigations, suggesting, at the very least, that Shireen Abu Akleh was killed by an Israeli sniper and that there was no other violence occurring in the area at the time. All of the speakers have again and again said that there is no shortage of evidence, given the footage and so on, not just in Shireen's killing, I must add, but in various other instances, including those protests on the Gaza-Israel border in 2018. They've referred to the attacks by Israeli forces on the pallbearers at Shireen's funeral as well, something which, again, was well documented. So, in their eyes, the dossier is solid. The evidence is clear. What they are now hoping the international community will do is stop making excuses and start launching legal action. As we've heard from our guest, it's quite within the remit of the ICC to actually start to look into Shireen Abu Akleh's killing. Whether or not they do so could have a big implication, as we've heard from our guests, as to how safely journalists in Palestine, including Palestinian journalists, but foreign journalists as well, how safely they can actually do their job.
Nadeem Baba there for us in London. Thanks, Nadeem. Let's cross over to Munir Nushebai. He's a professor of international law at Al-Quds University and joins me now from occupied East Jerusalem. Professor, thanks very much for joining us on Al Jazeera. We heard from Nadeem in his question to the panel at that press conference about how far they expect the action to go in terms of all of the credible evidence that's been gathered and the fact that Israel is not a signatory to the ICC, it doesn't recognise it, and generally, as we heard from our previous speaker, always says that any investigations into the deaths of Palestinians or Palestinian journalists are closed, and that's the end of the matter. How much traction or how far do you think this particular action by Al Jazeera and by those journalist groups and lawyers will proceed when it comes to stating their case to the ICC?
As a human rights defender working in Palestine and working on Palestinian human rights generally, I'm actually quite happy and grateful for the event that Al Jazeera has conducted today. Not only because Al Jazeera is organizing its own lawyers, as well as working with and collaborating with a number of lawyers who are going to work on the case of Shireen Abu Akleh, as well as other journalists in Palestine. But also because it has actually conducted this press conference today. And the reason behind what I'm saying is that the International Criminal Court has actually confirmed its jurisdiction, as mentioned more than a year ago, in the occupied Palestinian territory, in the territory of the state of Palestine. However, The International Criminal Court, I should explain, is different from many other courts that people are used to observing. It's not a court where there is a plaintiff and a defendant. It's not a court where states can file cases against each other. It's actually a court that has a gatekeeper, and this gatekeeper is the International Criminal Court prosecutor, currently Mr. Karim Khan. And the only person who can actually start and accuse a person of a war crime or a crime against humanity is the International Criminal Court prosecutor. Palestinian civil society, as well as many other organizations, human rights organizations, have been providing the International Criminal Court with a lot of information on war crimes and crimes against humanity that have taken place in the occupied Palestinian territory since 2014, the year in which the jurisdiction of the court starts. However, until today, we haven't seen the International Criminal Court starting seriously with filing cases and accusing individuals of war crimes, while we watch simultaneously that the International Criminal Court has moved much more quickly in other files in the world. And this is because in many cases, the International Criminal Court is politicized, unfortunately.
So can I just jump in there then? How easy is it going to be for the ICC to ask Israel to basically play ball and give them the evidence that they want? Because, yes, as you say, that the ICC is the gatekeeper, and it has a certain amount of evidence that's going to be presented in front of it from one side of this case, i.e., media groups, journalist organisations that we've just heard from, but it also needs Israel to cooperate, and Israel does not recognise the ICC. So the question is how difficult it's going to be for them and for Karim Khan to get to speak to Israel on that level for that information.
Yeah, I mean, the prosecutor of the ICC can certainly communicate with Israel and ask for cooperation and evidence. If Israel decides to cooperate, then that's wonderful. However, we know that Israel does not accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court on the state of Palestine. It does not accept that Palestine is actually a state. And there are many other countries in the world that also follow the example of Israel in this case and also deny the fact that Palestine is a state. However, from the point of view of the International Criminal Court, Palestine is a state, and the fact that Israel is not a member of the ICC is totally irrelevant. The fact that Palestine is a state is the reason why the court has jurisdiction over Palestine, because Palestine requested this jurisdiction. So regardless of whether the Israelis decide to cooperate with the court or decide not to cooperate, this is not totally relevant, actually. What is relevant is the fact that the International Criminal Court deciding to take this case as well as many other cases, the case of settlements, the cases of forcible displacement in the occupied Palestinian territory, torture, and many other cases that have been already filed, the collective punishment on Gaza, the military operations in Gaza, all of these cases and information has been filed, and we are still waiting for the International Criminal Court prosecutor to start his action. Now, certainly, the International Criminal Court has complementary jurisdiction. This means that they need to know that either the states that are relevant to a specific violation or war crime are unwilling or unable to conduct a specific investigation and prosecution in cases of war crimes. But we have learned over the history that Israel is unwilling to prosecute criminals when it comes to war crimes conducted in the occupied Palestinian territory. And we also know that the state of Palestine is unable to prosecute Israeli war criminals because it is under occupation, it is under the governance of the Israeli army itself.
Yeah. Indeed. So just very briefly, sir, in terms of timeline, when would you think all of this might actually start to build up traction? And what should we look out for in terms of a timeline?
I cannot predict, unfortunately. I mean, I would want the International Criminal Court prosecutor to start working today. right? However, it's very important. And that's why I am happy that there is this press conference today and that there is this action. It's very important not only to lobby the prosecutor himself, but also the Assembly of States that are members to the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute. We need pressure on the International Criminal Court and on the prosecutor to take action. He could, not take action at all. We could wait for another, year or 2 or 10 years or 100 years with no action. And he could take action, within days, right? It depends on his will to start investigating Palestine. Okay. And we know for sure that Donald Trump in his times decided to punish the International Criminal Court partly because of its investigation of Israel.
Indeed, we shall see what happens, and we'll keep obviously a very close eye on this story. For the moment, Professor, thanks so much for joining us. Munir Nosbahi from occupied East Jerusalem. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Let's
cross over to Rob Matheson, our correspondent, who's waiting for us at Damascus Gate in occupied East Jerusalem. Obviously, you've heard a lot of analysis there, Rob, about what the experts think is going to happen and could happen in the next few days and weeks. But really, there's been an outpouring, as we know, of anger and grief over the murder of our colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh. But it's only added, really, to the frustration of many Palestinians who want to see firm results. And that's the big question mark, isn't it? What are people there saying to you as they sort of arrive for Friday prayers?
Sohail, I think the best way of summing it up is to say that they're hopeful, but they're not really optimistic. I mean, as we've heard, this is by no means the first time that this kind of incident has happened. It's by no means that the prosecutions have been attempted to be brought to try to find somebody responsible. But throughout all that process that has happened in the past, nobody ultimately has had a successful prosecution. Nobody has been identified and nobody has been brought to justice. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, that, as I say, whilst they might be optimistic or at least hopeful that this case might get somewhere with the ICC, particularly because of the fame of Shireen Abu Akleh in this particular case. There's no sense that people actually believe that this process may even begin. They're very, very cautious about this. Let me give you just a little bit of a background as to the kind of what's happening here in Palestine as far as the investigations are concerned. The Palestinian Authority, for example, has held its own investigation, and it has concluded that an Israeli soldier fired the bullet that killed Shireen Abu Akleh. It says that it is in possession of that bullet. Now, the Israeli military is holding its own internal investigation, always does in cases like this. The Israeli military, police say that they're not going to bring a criminal investigation because they don't believe that there was a criminal case to answer. But the Israelis, the Palestinians refuse to hand over the bullet to the Israelis because, as they say, they simply don't trust the Israelis to be transparent about an investigation. And in many ways, that is the level of distrust that Palestinians have been dealing with here over the years whenever there has been a case that has been brought like this. Now, as we've heard before from your previous guests, that the ICC has now agreed that its jurisdiction spreads to this particular area. It says in Article 8 of its own charter, it says that killing or maiming journalists in war zones or occupied areas is technically a war crime. But as far as the Palestinians are concerned, they're just waiting to see how far, if at all, this prosecution, this case, actually moves forward with the ICC. What is important, however, is, as some of your guests have already alluded to, in wider terms, and certainly in terms of future prosecutions in this region, this is going to be a test for the International Criminal Court for its level of influence and the authority that it wields in this region. And in many ways, Palestinians are looking at that as well, because if the ICC, they say, does not stand up and be counted and take this case and hear it properly, it's going to lose all authority, or what little authority it thinks it has in this region.
Rob Matheson for us there in occupied East Jerusalem. Thanks, Rob.